I'll just give a brief overview in terms of climate adaptation and resilience in country, and that's for Zimbabwe. So a bit of a context to that. So obviously the background is extreme poverty actually in Zimbabwe has actually been on an upward trend. In 2017, it was 30%. And then the latest figures we have for based on the 2019 data, it has gone to 38%. And given the existing circumstances, it's actually projected to reach 50% by end of this year, which is a bit worrisome. And the number of people in extreme poverty is actually increasing from 4.5 million to 6 million in 2 years. That's a big concern. And obviously, over half of the population is actually food insecure. Critical sectors such as health and education indicators are actually deteriorating with increasing in mortality rates and increasing risk of contagious diseases such as cholera, diarrhea, and many others. So at the center of all this brief background, climate change and extreme weather events are obviously there. This is the third consecutive drought we have had over the past seasons. And obviously in March last year, we experienced one of the worst tropical cyclones we had. So from our analysis, I think we're also having a tropical cyclone once in 3 years since the year 2000. So this sets the picture in terms of where we are and what the context is looking like. And obviously the other things like the economy, which is not performing well, the lack of investment in sustainable development from the government in particular. And we've also seen donor fatigue in terms of investment in some critical sectors, for example, in the water and sanitation. So what does this mean for our country? So obviously, building adaptation resilience for the most vulnerable and systems to climate change is a priority for Zimbabwe. The government of Zimbabwe has actually very good climate policy and strategies, which are actually consistent with the UK position on climate adaptation and resilience. So how do we plan to move forward and what is our response to that? So the government is currently working on a national climate adaptation response plan, which we are keen to be part of through our programs. We want to seize that opportunity and make sure we have the right technologies in terms of particularly some of the things that we want to look at is actually improved in preparedness and response. So we're also looking at enhancing the climate services and other weather information services as well. Within our programs, we are also trying to, at design stage, as much as possible, to mainstream climate adaptation where possible. And our current response so far, as an office, we have got an ambition to increase our climate spend from 10 to 50% in the next 5 years. Much of it, obviously, looking at climate adaptation as a priority to Zimbabwe compared to mitigation. We think our spend will be mostly on adaptation and building resilience. So we have programs that are currently working on those two. We've got the Resilience Building Fund, which actually is looking at 3 main components, one of which is trying to build evidence and enable the use of evidence in terms of building resilience. So it's actually doing some form of analytical work in terms of understanding the risks and how we can respond to that. The other component is actually, they've got a crisis modifier component in that program. This is actually in anticipation of shocks happening in Zimbabwe anytime. So the crisis modifier will just be there to provide that sort of relief and make sure the communities and institutions we are supporting do not actually lose the focus on resilience and also trying to protect and maintain the gains. So the other component is actually continue to helping communities to absorb, adapt, and is good work on terms of transformation. So that's the Resilience Building Fund. That's a multi-donor program with the EU and Sweden. It's managed by UNDP. Then we also have a humanitarian resilience program, which has just been approved. It's mainly a humanitarian program, but it has a resilience building component, particularly focusing on urban areas, given the exposure to the urban communities. Most of our work has been actually rural focused, and we will try to look at what are the resilience alternatives in urban areas that are not only agro-based. So this is just starting now, but hasn't actually done much in terms of resilience. And then we also have a £19 million program that was approved last year, which is currently at feasibility. So this is a climate adaptation, water and renewable energy program, which we intend to, through water and renewable energy, to strengthen and help people adapt and build resilience around the two. This considers the importance of the two, water and access to clean and renewable energy, to various sectors. So it will prioritize, I think, some of the UK priorities like girls' education, agriculture. It also look at health, particularly now. I think with what's happening, I think health really is really becoming an issue. So it will do that through infrastructure. So that's currently at feasibility. Feasibility is actually at procurement on that. How do we work with CMPs as a country? To be quite honest, we have not really engaged much with CMPs on adaptation and resilience. I think they could be happening or they could not be happening, but we have seen quite a list of CMPs. So what we actually don't have is that level of country engagement with various SROs on CMPs. With the kind of resources that we have as DFID and also restricted country budgets, I think it's really important to take stock and have the SROs engage with countries, because I think there's lots actually we can draw down and buy into programs. For us, I think the things that we think would buy from CMPs around weather and climate information services, I think around issues around technical assistance, on issues related to adaptation and resilience, issues on resilience monitoring and reporting and preparing for resilience in difficult circumstances. So there are actually opportunities we could actually use CMPs. But more positively, we engaging significantly with the transboundary water resources management, which has CREDIF as part of that. I think that really has been a good example in terms of how we can actually draw down from CMP. So it's technically, it's the management, it's the coordination. It's really been a good example through CREDIF. So I think it sets a good example in terms of how we can work with CMPs. So more needs to be done, in particularly with SROs working on CMPs that are working in Zimbabwe. So what are the challenges in terms of resilience and adaptation in Zimbabwe from our experience? So mainly, I think it's because of the exposure to various shocks and emergencies in the country. So it's really been very difficult in terms of shaping and planning your long-term development because we have had to respond to various emergencies. I think the staff meeting we've just had, I think it's this kind of situation where you have got to tailor make and make your program more flexible to respond to crisis. So that's one challenge we have actually been focusing in the past 3-4 years. And then partner capacity measuring and tracking and reporting resilience. It's really been a big challenge for us. I'm speaking from a Zimbabwe Resilience Building Fund point of view. So it's really partners not really getting it in terms of setting the baselines for you to be able to measure resilience and also the capacity to do that along the way. We have set out, I think, the past 2 financial years to report on key performance indicator on resilience, but we have not done that because the process has actually taken long, because we feel we don't have the right and quality data to actually confidently report that we have held resilience. And also, in any case, I think given the humanitarian, the emergencies that we have had to deal with and the exposure to drought in particular, it's really been a challenging context in terms of building resilience around that, because I think what matters are most immediate needs for communities and institutions other than looking at long term. So that's one challenge we've also been facing. From a national government point of view, I think it's trying to get the balance between really prioritizing adaptation and resilience versus mitigation. We understand, I think, the potential and that investing in renewables would give. I think the financial, I think in terms of putting the government of Zimbabwe accessing finance, I think it's a good idea to focus on mitigation. But then how to prioritize that? I think for us, given the vulnerability and the exposure, it would really make more sense, really a focus on adaptation and resilience without really forgetting the potential and the opportunities that arise on mitigation, particularly on developing renewables and upscaling renewables. I mean, given Zimbabwe's rich endowment of renewable energy resources. Having said that, it's really been positive actually in terms of funding that's coming in. So last week, GCF approved another resilience program for Zimbabwe with UNDP, which is quite positive. And obviously, the current state of the economy, which I've mentioned earlier on, does not give us many options for resilience and adaptation. I think we're always working on with restrictions, particularly, for example, I'm looking at investing in sustainable climate risk financing. The current situation in Zimbabwe doesn't help that anyway, because actually you really struggle to find models that work because the local currency actually is really devaluing fast. And then finally, as a challenge, it's work we have been doing on COP26. We have got 4 priorities, adaptation and resilience being one of them, but we don't really get to see that being articulated the same way that we get articulation on work around mitigation, green growth, financing. So we'd like to see that, I think, being articulated. And what we've also seen, the way engagements plan are actually structured, it's actually more on NDCs, low emission development strategies, and not really much in terms of how best we can actually portray or demonstrate the country priorities in terms of adaptation and resilience. But again, I think work around COP26 has been a good exercise actually in terms of rethinking and challenging yourself in terms of what really matters for the country, getting that balance. I think it's really been very useful as an exercise. But I would want to see COP26, if ever it happens, giving a good balance in terms of articulating the 4 themes. So I think this is a brief overview in terms of how we're doing in terms of adaptation and resilience. Specifically looking at negotiations at COP in terms of access to financing for adaptation and resilience. I think this could be a very good point for negotiation. And also probably another point, I think the other 3 themes, particularly the first 2 on finance, on green growth, I think they're quite specific in terms of numbers and what we want to achieve. But you don't really get to find those specific and targets when you look at the adaptation and resilience theme. So I think it would be an ask for us to really think through and look at what we can actually do and set really smart objectives around that. Well, I think it depends on how you've set your programs and what sort of opportunities are you looking at in countries. It's actually really context specific, and also it actually depends on the kind of interest and ambition from your top leadership. So for us, I think we have an ambassador and the head of DFID who are actually quite really keen to see work on climate being promoted. So it actually depends. And also it actually depends on how you set out your programs at design stage. So thinking through that at the initial stage, I think it's important, but I really agree. It's really country specific and depending on your context. I think our conversations with the government on COP26, I think is quite positive. So firstly, I think Zimbabwe has been an active country on COP in general. And I think for COP26, I think they're actually looking at it because I think they've got an ambitious target to showcase on NDCs. And I think they want to continue pushing for the African voice in terms of negotiating for much simpler ways of accessing financing. They've got a long-term low-emission development strategy they've put in place, which I think they're really keen to use the COP26 to showcase that. And not only that, so Zimbabwe, if you look at that, I think in terms of Zimbabwe accessing financing from international financing institutions, it's not an option because they're actually restricted in getting that. So the COP platform is that opportunity. COP26 is an opportunity for them to engage and try to get a network and connect with the private financiers who can actually bring in money to Zimbabwe for green growth. And so they're actually looking at that with keen interest, and we've actually been engaging positively in terms of setting out the priorities. What does the country needs? I think this is what is actually shaping our response to the engagement plan. So that's very positive, and I hope it maintains like that.